Keys, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that are read for the last 40 years. And today, I have my special guest. He's the author of the five-star reviewed Alpha Male and the forthcoming series, The American Trilogy. No other than Mr. Sam Foster.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm glad to be here.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Foster, and can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm delighted to, Daniel. My name is Sam Foster. I am an author. I have been writing for about 20 years now. My first book was 21 years ago, which was Alpha Male. The thing that I have been working on for the last 5 years is a trilogy, which is the history of the American Northwest Territories from 1769 to 1999. The three books, the original was A Panther Crosses Over, and that was the 18th century history of that area. The second book was titled Beardstown, which was the 19th century history of that area. And the current one, which came out a week ago today, American Pied Piper, is a 20th century history of that part of the world. All of them are historic novels. When I say histories, they are novels. There's simply historic fiction is my genre.
Interesting, Mr. Foster. So, what age did you realize that you're good in writing?
That's a really good question, Daniel, because I did not start that way. I have always been a voracious reader my entire life, and probably with an interest in writing, certainly an interest in reading. But I will admit that when I got out of school and started life, I had no interest whatever in being a starving artist. I wanted to have a little money. I wanted to have a little comfort. And so it wasn't until after a relatively long career in business that I started to write, and that was about 20 years ago. That first book, Alpha Male, A Tale of the Battle of Commerce is the full title, was about the business in which I had worked, which was commercial real estate. And that story was the story of a real estate hustle set in Los Angeles. The area and the subject, something about which I knew a great deal. And then since then, I just started writing. That original book was written over lunch hours and evenings at the LA County Library. I would walk from my office to the library, sit quiet corner, and with pen and pencil, it's been that long ago, wrote it up.
So, who are your favorite authors that influence you the most?
My favorite authors tend to be of the historic fiction genre. It's what I read, it's what I write. My favorite is Stephen Pressfield. His Gates of Fire is one of the best books I have ever read. The Virtues of War, also his, is one of the best I've ever read. If you've never read it, his Last of the Amazons is a tremendous paean to the power of women. I really like Pressfield. Pressfield and I have in common that we're both Marines, and he says, and I think it's sort of cute but interesting, that he learned more about writing in the Marine Corps than anywhere else because the Marine Corps taught him to love misery. Perhaps the best book that I have ever read won a Pulitzer, and that was Killer Angels, which is a novelized history of the Civil War. The title of that book comes from a conversation between the commanding officer of the regiment, who was an academic and highly educated American academic, and his top sergeant, who is British trained, uneducated Irishman. And the commanding officer says to his top sergeant, "Men are angels." And the wise old top sergeant says back to him, "Commander Darlin, if man is an angel, he is certainly a killer angel." It is those kinds of stories from which I take my path.
Interesting, Mr. Foster. If you describe the writings of your favorite authors, what are they? Or what is it?
But my favorite authors are indeed Shira and Pressfield. And
Oh,
I've just described both of their books.
okay. Sounds interesting, Mr. Foster. And what are your short term and long term goals in writing?
Daniel, this is going to sound incredibly arrogant, but when I started writing the trilogy, which was 5 years ago, and at least half of the length of that writing was research. I spent 2 weeks in the Abraham Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois, have made a series of trips to Illinois and Indiana, which is where it's located. And but when I started writing it, I came to believe that the reason the good Lord had put me on this earth was to write this trilogy. And when the last book of the trilogy came out, a week ago today, Daniel, it came out. When the last book came out, I would have thought that I would be joyous, that I would think, whoopee, a 5-year labor completed. And while I did have some of that in me, my real feeling was absolute depression that I had worked for 5 years on this task. I had completed it, and I thought successfully. I think it's a good book, particularly this last one. The American Pied Piper is, I think, an absolutely excellent book, and it's been very well reviewed. But I felt depressed, and I wondered if it was possible for an author to have postpartum depression. It's just, what am I going to do now? And I'm going to have to find something else to write. I'm going to have to, as a friend of mine said when I made that complaint to him, he said, "It's time to get back up on the horse."
So, are you doing the advice?
Yeah, I am actually, Daniel. I'm a man who is never down for long. I'm like all human beings. I'll have little fits of anxiety, but they never last more than about 24 hours. I am a get back up on the horse and do it again guy. I am happiest when I am working. And in this case, I have immediately started working on a novel about 3 Italian women in the 15th and 16th century. And I also, and this was the suggestion of a friend, she said to me, "A Panther Crosses Over," which was the first book of the trilogy, would make a fabulous movie. And I know nothing about writing scripts, but I'm now going to UCLA and taking a script writing class just to have something to do.
Very well said, Mr. Foster. But before we go on, I want to shout out to the people listening in Finland. Thank you, Finland, for supporting this podcast, because in Uusimaa, I got 64% audience share. North Karelia at 7%, North Savo at 7%, Southwest Finland at 7%, Pirkanmaa at 7%, and last but not the least, North Ostrobothnia at 7%. Thank you, Finland, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Mr. Sam Foster. Which one of your books are we going to talk about today?
I would prefer to talk about the brand new one, which I think is the best, and that is American Pied Piper. It's the one I sent you the review of, Daniel.
Yes. What inspired you to write American Pied Piper?
Daniel, I am an American, born and bred. I was born in America in the Midwest. I travel a lot, but I have never lived in any other country than America. And I have watched it. I am an old man. I'm 79 years old. And I have watched America change dramatically over the course of my life. And my attempt in writing the novel But each of the books is about 400 pages. The total of the trilogy is just a little under 1,200 pages, and it's just a little over 300,000 words. My interest in writing that was to talk about how America has changed, but not from an academic standpoint. I'm a storyteller, and I wanted to tell stories that reflected the changes in America over time and the changes in America's outlook on the world and generalized personality. In American Pied Piper starts in 1905 and it ends in 1999. So it is the length of the century. And it starts out with telling a story of a young man who is a working class, almost impoverished young man, but he has aspirations. And we watch him through the course of his life rise economically, become significant in his community, own a very successful business where he meets any number of rich and famous people. He rises by his own bootstraps, but he watches the town around him transfer itself from a town who is completely free, where men are able to rise or fall, allowed to fall on their own skills and abilities. And if you fall, you fall. If you rise, you rise. And he watches that change into an America not so full of liberties at all, but America absolutely bound by rules and political change. And we watch a political figure in the town where he is completely, quote, clean it up. Daniel, I don't know how many of your readers are familiar with the British myth of the Pied Piper, but the Pied Piper comes to a town called Hamelin, and this is in the 15th century, and it's full of rats. And the rats are carrying fleas, and the fleas carry the plague, and the town can't get rid of the rats. And the Pied Piper says that he will get rid of the rats for them. And they offer him 1,000 guilders. I don't know what a guilder is, but that's what it says in the myth, 1,000 guilders. And he does indeed. He goes to the middle of the town. He starts playing his flute, his pipe. All the rats follow him. He leads them into the river and he drowns them. He cleans the city of rats entirely. The city now becomes a clean place, orderly. But the town refuses to pay the piper what they have promised him. So he tries to get paid and they won't. So he goes back into the middle of town with his pipe, plays a different tune. All of the town's children come to him and he leads them into the river and drowns them. The moral of the story is that he has cleaned the town of all of its ugliness, but in doing so, he has also cleaned it of all of its creativity. There is none left. And this crusading politician in this little town absolutely cleans it. He cleans it of gambling. He cleans it of prostitution. He cleans it of vice in general. He cleans it of all of the things that are we now in America think entirely appropriate to clean. And the town dies. There's no room for creativity. The railroad, which has been the source of its wealth, leaves the town, and the town has no insight or brilliance to find the next thing which will restore it to its wealth and prosperity. And all of its children leave, as all of the children in the Midwest have. They've all left small towns and they've gone to New York, or they've gone to Chicago, or they've gone to Los Angeles. But they no longer have opportunity in the towns where they grew up. And the last scene in the book is this old crusading politician who is now an old man with a cane and stooped over and damn near blind. And he looks at his town and he cannot help but wonder if his life's work was a complete failure, if he ruined what he was trying to perfect. And so, really, the moral of the story is, does perfection drive out liberty? Is there not a battle between virtue and vice that we all struggle with every day? And when does control by those people who want the town to be perfect and not flawed drive out those people who see a new and better way? That's the story.
Very well said, Mr. Foster. So, can you describe the research process behind American Pied Piper?
Well, number one, you understand that the author's mentality about what he was trying to say was in his mind first. That America has gone from a place of freedom for people to rise and prosper in an attempt to protect us all from ourselves and to take away our ability to choose things, perhaps choose things that are bad for us, but to take those things away from us so we no longer have them, has made us perhaps a more virtuous society, but a far less creative one. And the author, that's me, had that thought in his mind when he started writing it. And we all talk in America about the failure of small towns, about how small towns used to be idyllic places where people could live prosperous and kind lives and know their neighbors. So I picked a small town in the Midwest, which was in the 19th century. America's prosperity came from river ports. River transportation was the way everything moved. Trade centers rely on transportation. So it was the river ports. And there are so many of them: St. Louis, Cincinnati, New Orleans, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh. America is full of cities that made wealth from river transportation. But the railroads took all of that away. There is still river transportation, but wealth went to railroads, and places of wealth became rail centers. Again, Los Angeles, Chicago. Chicago's the big one. Chicago's the biggest rail center in the country. That's where the wealth went. And so I picked a small town in the Midwest, which had been a river port. It still is, but it's a dying little river port, that had been a city creating wealth through the railroad. The railroad built a roundhouse and built a shop there. And a roundhouse is simply a place where trains gather, change loads, turn around, go back where they came from, and a shop. This was a town of some 15,000 people and had over 2,000 of them employed by the railroad. And the railroad left. And the reason the railroad left was over union strikes. They had union strikes everywhere, but they were worse in this particular place. And so the union finally just gave up and left and took its game to some other little city in Illinois. And the town died. It went from 15,000 people to today. The sign on the outside says population 5,800. And so I simply went to this city and researched it. And then I went to the closest big city, which was Springfield, Illinois, 50 miles away, and went to the biggest research library, which was the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and spent weeks reading microfiche, trying to flesh out this thesis. So it was not simply a thesis in the author's head, but could be told item by item and story by story. So it is a series of stories about this town, going from how it created wealth and prosperity to how its own decisions and population drove it to poverty.
Interesting, Mr. Foster. What challenges did you face while writing American Pied Piper?
Well, yeah, challenges. I suppose the biggest one for me, Daniel, is not writing. I rather enjoy writing. It's not that it's not work. It's not that it's not exhausting. I can actually do manual labor longer than I can do mental labor. In 3 or 3.5 hours of writing, I'm completely exhausted. And I have found out, I didn't know it, that the human brain uses more calories than the human body, and I can sure tell it when I write. But that's not so much a challenge for me. I enjoy it. I was an athlete when I was young. I spent a lot of time in the gym. I enjoyed it. It was exhausting, but I enjoyed it. The real challenge was in the research. Imagine, if you will, Daniel, or perhaps your authors can imagine, sitting in front of a screen reading microfiche for 9 hours a day while the research library was open. Reading microfiche, reading newspapers, reading articles in newspapers, trying to figure out what was worthy, what moved the story forward, what was a waste of time, taking notes on it, taking 2 weeks of solid notes, consolidating those notes into a storyline, transferring that storyline into a 1,200 page series of novels. That's work for me, Daniel. That wears me out.
How do you deal with writer's block?
Do you remember what I said about Stephen Pressfield, that he said the Marine Corps taught him more about writing than anything because they taught him to love misery?
Yes.
If you accept the misery, there is no such thing as writer's block. You sit down at the keyboard and you make your fingers hit something. And if it's crap, you go back and correct it. But you work, you work, you work, you work. And you don't simply sit there with your thumb up your butt and go, woe is me, what am I going to say? So I have a lot of work, but I've never not been able to work. I've never sat and looked at a blank page. Now, I will also say about that, Daniel, that, and you hear stories from writers about the muse coming and sitting on their shoulder, just a turn of the phrase for perspiration versus inspiration. Everything I write comes from work. It comes from perspiration. In a long writing career, at least 20 years of writing novels, the muse has only come to sit on my shoulder 2 times, only twice. And I admit it is a wonderful thing. It is a wonderful thing. It's better than drugs to sit at your keyboard and take dictation, not have to think, just have the words flow, not even from your brain, but your fingertips just flying across the keyboard, and you don't even know why. You don't know where it's coming from. It's just pouring out. That is a wonderful feeling, but it's only happened to me twice. Mostly I just have to work, Daniel. I have to work.
Mr. Foster, what's your daily writing routine like?
Daniel, you asked me if we could meet this morning at 7, and I told you I would be delighted to meet you at 7, but I was not normally up that early. I normally, the routine is I'll wake up about 8 in the morning, and I take about 2 hours to get started. I always start my day with reading some sort of spiritual thing. Right now, I've been on the Stoics. Every morning, I read something from one of the Stoics. I spend a few mornings in prayer, and I will either swim or do floor workouts, push-ups, calisthenics, yoga, that sort of thing. And after all that's done, take a shower, clean myself up, and sit down at the keyboard. And by then, it's 10 or maybe 11 o'clock in the morning. I will write, and I will write for about 3 hours. If I take 30 minutes for lunch, I'm always off the keyboard by 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon, because everything that's coming out of me after 3 hours of writing, everything that's coming out of me is bad. It's forced. It's not coming out at all. And that frees me up at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I'm like every other human being. There's so many details of the day. What has to be cleaned up? Go to the grocery store and buy the groceries, pay the bills, deal with the IRS, buy insurance, all of those things that all human beings have to do. And that comes late in the afternoon. But I try to save my best hours, which are for me from about 10 or 11 in the morning to about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I try to save those for my craft.
Interesting, Mr. Foster. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our third season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the best five-star restaurant in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about olive oil, people. Olive oil, one of the versatile ingredients in the kitchen. So please do listen. Food 101. Plus one more, our books are out. Not only one, but 8 volumes, people. Food 101, Volume 1 Basics until 8 volumes is all you need. How to create a delicious food. Available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So, Mr. Foster, what's one theme or message you hope readers will take away from American Piper?
I think that readers, when they read it, my hope is that when they read it, they read a history of America that is struggling with lack of creativity, that is forced into a mode where freedom of expression and creativity is forced into dark corners. And I hope that when they read that message, they won't hear it from a philosopher, but they will hear it from a storyteller. I think the story is a damn fine story. So let me be my last words to your audience. American Pied Piper, American Pied Piper, American Pied Piper.
Yes, people. So, how do you handle criticism, both constructive and negative?
I am a human being. I like being stroked. I can't deny it. I do. When somebody says something to when I read a good review, it makes me smile. When I read a poor review, it does bring me a little sadness, but I shake that off very quickly. And when I shake it off, what I try to do is say, what should I read in that I haven't seen that the reviewer does see? And how can that help me do a better job in the future? I am a man who firmly believes that if we ever stop changing, we start to die. We have to get better. We have to change. We have to learn. And I am an old man, but I'm not through doing that yet.
So, what advice or inspiring message for those aspiring writers out there?
It's not complicated. Write. Don't think about writing. Write. Don't wonder about it. Write. Don't think about what I should say. Write. If you want to go back and correct your writing, we all do. I edit mine 4 and 5 times. That's fine. But don't ponder it without putting your fingers on the keyboard. You got to put words on the page.
Certainly, people. What's the most rewarding aspect of being an author?
I'm going to sound religious, but I am. So I guess it comes out. Daniel, I don't know what God put you on earth to do. That's between you and God. That's for you to figure out what the message is. But God put me on earth to tell stories, and to tell stories that both interest people, but perhaps carry some wisdom in them, something worth pondering, something worth disagreeing with, something worth thinking through why you disagree with it, something worth coming to a firm opinion that the writer's full of crap, or something worth reading and thinking, there was something in there that I learned that may cause me to think just a little differently. And when I can create that, it makes me feel very whole.
Very well said, Mr. Foster. How do you feel about the current state of publishing industry, especially with the rise of self-publishing and digital platforms?
Daniel, how much time do I have to answer that question? Um, let's see. I'll say this. Number one, I'm a writer. I'm not a publisher. So my opinions about publishing are strictly that. They're personal, they're opinions. But I, publishing has changed entirely. And if I may, I'm going to tell you a story of a friend, a man named Charlie Newton. Charlie Newton has got 11 novels. They've been well reviewed, and a couple of them have sold very well. And Charlie Newton struggled through his first 8 novels to get recognized. And on his 8th novel, he got a new agent who was Dan Brown's agent, the guy who wrote Da Vinci Code. And the agent got him in one of his books to a major New York publishing house. And Charlie thought, I've made it. I've got an all-star agent. I've got an all-star publishing house. And Charlie was brokenhearted to find out. He said, when I got to the top of the mountain, there was no there there. Publishing has become, and because of electronics, I mean, I'm not going to lay any blame on any particular corporation, but it is because of modern technology where you can do print on demand. When I first started this, the question became for the publisher, how many copies of this can we publish? Because we can't send them back. Are we going to do 500? Are we going to do 1,000? Are we going to do 10,000? It's no longer like that. You can print on demand, and the publishing houses do it. And so nobody is very heavily invested in an author's work. It's easy and cheap to produce. It's so easy and cheap, an author can do it himself. And so there becomes no push behind any book. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's bad. I don't know. Maybe indeed it should be that the world is full of one-hit wonders like it now is with music, because the same things happen to music. Motown no longer has time to keep Smokey Robinson on as a writer for 15 years before they let him sing. Nobody has time to nourish creatives that way. You simply have to spit it out and hope that your work is good enough that somebody appreciates it, that it has made somebody's day better or more thoughtful. But there's nobody in the business now to stand behind you and say, we are going to stay with you. We are going to help you. We are going to show you how you have erred. We were going to show you how you get better. An author has to do this on their own. And if they're not willing to do that, their life is going to be full of misery.
If you go back and give advice to yourself when you were first starting out as a writer, what would it be?
Daniel, I'm going to tell them this story because I'm a storyteller. Raymond Chandler and I have something in common. Raymond Chandler, the sort of famous author of LA noir kind of not cop novels, private detective novels. Raymond Chandler was an executive with the Los Angeles Oil Company. And he wrote his first 2 books while he was employed as the vice president of an oil company. And I followed the Raymond Chandler model. I did not have the courage to starve to death in a little cold room somewhere writing and hope that I came up with enough money to feed myself and keep the heat turned on. I wrote my first 2 books while I was working as an executive with a Los Angeles firm. And for me, and I'm not sure this is good wisdom or advice for an internet author, but for me, that was the safe and best route. It let me to live a normal life, to keep my kids in school, to keep my mortgage paid. And so I learned to nurture myself slowly instead of all at once. And I'm not sure I did that right, but it was a method that gave me a pretty good life.
Interesting, Mr. Foster. So can you please invite our listeners to buy all their books?
Yes, of course. And if I may, I mean, this is your podcast, not mine, Daniel, but you're allowing me the opportunity. I would like to offer them my website, which is www.samfosterbooks.com. And they can go to that site and they can see everything I've ever written. They have seen the critical reviews of it. They can see summaries of it. They can decide whether that story is of interest to them or not. So I would say, in addition to, if you're listening to my voice, to scribble down American Pied Piper, which you can get anywhere. You can get at all the conventional places. When I say all the conventional places, Ingram Sparks published it, which means every bookstore in America can get it if they don't have it. And it is, of course, available at Amazon. So it's available any place you prefer to buy books. American Pied Piper. But I would also encourage you, before you simply fly off and do that, to look at a review of the book, to look at a summary of the book. And that would be www.samfosterbooks.com.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Sam Foster, because if you support him, more books to come.
There's when I get through with you, Daniel, I'll have breakfast, I'll take a shower, and then I'll start working on a book called Thy Mother is a Lioness, because I constantly work.
That'd be awesome. And you are most welcome to come back and promote all your books if you have time.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. That's most kind of you. I will reach out to you when something happens that your audience may find worthwhile.
Yes, thank you. Listen notes for my latest score of 26 and belong to 10% popular show globally, and Fake Spot for being the number 7 best art book podcast need to be followed this 2023. So, Mr. Foster, American Pied Piper, what is the best highlight?
I think the best highlight is watching a man produce a productive and worthy life. He is a young man who starts out on the frontier. He doesn't start out in Illinois. He starts out on the frontier. He has no real education other than some years of grade school on the frontier. But he has ambition and he has aspiration. And he makes a very good life for himself. And in the end, he reflects back on his life of what have I done well and what have I done poorly. And it is looking at his life that we see the city, that we see the changes in the city. Some of the changes he has fought, some of the changes he has been part of. But the question really is, what makes a good life? That's probably the best part of the book. What makes a good life?
Interesting, Mr. Foster, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.